Good evening and welcome to Tech, Sex, and Power, the Intimate and the Political. So tonight I want to acknowledge that Western University is located on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenape, and the Chungtung nations on lands connected with the London Township and Sombre Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. This land continues to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and vital contributors to our society. Now, in the room with me tonight, I have Cornel Grey, Assistant Professor in Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies. Dr. Cornel Grey's research focuses primarily on the health of Black queer men. His current project includes a qualitative study examining the impact of positive touch on the health of Black queer men and an archival study examining Black queer diasporic networks. I also have Caitlin Mendez, Canadian Research Chair in Inequality and Gender, also in Western's Department of Sociology. Caitlin is a sociologist whose work sits at the intersection of media, education, and politics. Her research and teaching adopt an intersectional feminist perspective to better understand and combat gender inequalities and their relationship with media technologies. And finally, we have Trina Orchard, Associate Professor, School of Health Studies. Dr. Trina Orchard is an anthropologist and author who researches sexuality, gender, and health among marginalized groups within the context of her own life. She's the author of Sticky, Sexy, Sad, Swipe Culture and the Darker Side of Dating Apps, Toronto University Press, that explores the digitization of love in the 21st century. And I'm Annalise, and I work within student experience in terms of gender-based violence prevention at Western University. So we're going to get this started with a question for everyone, and then we'll kind of go and flow from there. So Caitlin, I'm going to put it to you first, but each will have a turn. We'll do Caitlin, Cornel, then Trina. So where and how does tech, sex, and power show up in your research?
Thanks, Annalise, and thanks everybody so much for coming. We really appreciate you giving up time in your day to be here. So sex, tech, and power shows up in many places in my research. Most recently, I'm doing research with a team of people across Canada on something called tech-facilitated sexual violence. And this is a new term. It's something probably many of you aren't familiar with, and it's really referring to the ways that digital technologies are increasingly playing a role in what we think of when it comes to sexual and gender-based violence. So it can be the ways that digital technologies come into play when it comes to rape threats. It could be the ways that forms of sexual gender-based violence are filmed and then uploaded and shared. Or increasingly, we see things around non-consensual distribution of intimate images. Or even most recently, we've seen it come up in the ways that AI is being used to generate deep fake intimate images of people. So that's kind of one of the key ways that we can definitely see sex and tech, and also issues of power. We note from our research. So the research I do right now is with teens, so young people ages 13 to 18, and we've been going around Canada talking to teens about their experiences of tech-facilitated sexual violence. And it does seem to be overwhelmingly that men continue to be perpetrators of this form of violence. Women certainly play or have higher risk of experiencing tech-facilitated sexual violence, and the risk really increases depending on other social locations. So race, sexuality, indigeneity, age also plays a role. But we are increasingly actually seeing more men as victims, particularly of sextortion. So cases where somebody creates a fake account, often pretending to be a young woman, messages men sexy messages, sends them nude images, gets a nude image in return, and then we see extortion playing out. So, I will kind of flag that we are still analyzing some of the data, and this research isn't yet complete, but absolutely when we're analyzing this tech, we are interested in power dynamics, gender dynamics, and thinking of how this plays out in and through tech. Maybe just one other thing that I'll say before I let Trina and Cornel speak is that I think it's also important as researchers when we're thinking about sex and tech, it's really easy to kind of have these like very pessimistic points of view where we're scared of tech, but also recognize the way that a lot of the sex that happens online is consensual. And particularly in my research, when I'm talking about young people, there's kind of this assumption that, young people who are sending nudes to each other, that it's always bad, that it's always harmful. And I think this is something that we also really need to interrogate as researchers, is we need to very much distinguish between these kinds of acts that are consensual and non-consensual when we're doing this research. So I'll finish there, and I'm sure I'll have lots more to say about this.
Thanks, Caitlin. Cornel?
Great. Thanks everyone for being here, and thanks to James and Trina for the invitation. Excuse me. So I'll answer with respect to a project that I worked on a few years ago. It was a qualitative project where we focused on where a team of folks interviewed 93 gay, bisexual, and queer men in Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. And we were asking participants basically about their experiences or the impact of COVID on their lives, generally speaking. So as you can imagine, COVID transformed how researchers engaged in data collection. So we were very much tied to virtual interviews, which was an interesting experience both for us as researchers and for the participants during lockdown. So we were asking folks about impact of COVID on their social life, work life, sex life. So they talked about, shifts to, being on lockdown, and then everyone's doing like these Zoom meetings. And so people had all sorts of feelings about that. As you can imagine, when it came to things like mental health services, participants spoke about, some people preferred, meeting with their therapists, their counselors online. Some people didn't so much. There was one person I spoke to that's previously attended like a group sessions, and he wasn't comfortable doing like the virtual group sessions because he wasn't always aware of who was in the room. But other folks spoke about how, these kind of like virtual spaces, what that meant to them in terms of like building community. So there was also a trans participant who spoke about meeting. I should also mention, maybe as a bit of a background, many of the trans folks that we spoke to who are part of this study talked about how they were discovering online spaces where they could, build a community, through Reddit and TikTok and all these other kinds of platforms. And one person would say they were going through a transition at the time, and they were saying that they're grateful to have virtual spaces where they can engage and meet other members of their community, but there's some hesitation there because the nature of things that they don't always know, and they have particular kinds of questions about navigating the transition process, and they don't want to find out later on that they were, let's say, talking to someone underage, for example, right? So there were some real significant concerns around some of those pieces. So Katie actually reminded me of something I forgot. So we also spoke to a couple of folks who were engaging in camming. And so the COVID was an interesting kind of space where people had more attention, for their kind of business, and so they were getting more attention. But this one Asian participant that was in Montreal was talking about how that also brought like increased like anti-Asian racism, right? So all sorts of like awful comments in the chat rooms as well. So that was also kind of something that we had to navigate as well. And then there was another thing I just wanted to touch. Oh, so by the time we got to vaccination, that was a kind of fascinating process when it came to people talking about their experiences on dating apps. So previously, we're in an environment where people, I guess, were somewhat used to familiar with being told, well, we don't want the whole thing about, no fats, no blacks, no femmes, no Asians. People sometimes screened based on HIV status. Now we were in a very interesting environment where people were also invested in vaccination status, right? So some people were including it in their their headers, their titles. I believe later on, apps like Grindr, I think, had included like a different category for people to indicate their vaccination status. And while one might say, well, there's something quite nice about being, pro-vaccine, where we're kind of like destigmatizing and, making it doesn't feel like a high stakes environment. What we found in terms of participant responses were vaccine certificates were becoming, or vaccine declarations were becoming this really interesting way for people to establish hierarchies of desirability, basic, right? So you had to be vaccinated, you had to have like 3 vaccinations at the time, and so on. And so, yeah, very kind of like interesting, curious conversations were happening there around questions of sexual desirability and so on. So hopefully those are just some initial thoughts that might prompt further discussion, but I'll allow Trina to jump in.
Great, thank you. I feel like my response is going to be a little bit more meta in the sense that I'm a relatively new traveler in the world of technology research, but as a feminist, post-colonial scholar working in sexuality, gender, and health for over 20 years, especially working with different kinds of communities, so different groups of people in different kinds of sex work, Indigenous communities off and on reserve, rural Vancouver, London, different parts of Canada, as well as people impacted by HIV and AIDS. So, issues of power have been instrumental in my research for a very long time, looking at the distribution, the inequitable distribution of resources, different kinds of embodied experiences, but also, as Katie was reminding us, there are lots of powerful and productive ways that pleasure shows up, sex and power as well. But in terms of the technological piece, as I said, I'm sort of a new traveler in this area. I've been sort of looking at different aspects of technology, primarily in relation to dating apps, which is what my memoir is about. And I'm still a Flintstone in terms of, I have maybe 25 apps on my phone, but I am really fascinated by the culture of technology. And in my own experience, just how quickly I became a devotee of the swipe. And, looking at my subjectivity as, a Flintstone person, not really into technology, but how quickly I became sort of part of this digital rabbit hole that I was falling into, and the different observations about sex and power, and memories of trying to date while during the pandemic, and sort of as Cornel said, when those moments were beginning to appear when vaccinations were available, and how those were used as just an additional way to screen and or classify one another. And sometimes it could really make the swiping a lot more streamlined. It's like, no, no, no. But that was interesting, the way that these are sort of used as flags or symbols. And it tells you a lot about politics and things like that as well. But maybe I'll just leave it there for now, and then come back to the different projects I've been involved in, and et cetera, as we go on.
Thanks, Trina. So you've all actually started to sort of sprinkle into this next question, but let's open it up a bit more. How do power relations change and or stay the same when it comes to tech-facilitated violence? So how do power relations change or stay the same when it comes to tech-facilitated violence? Who would like to give that a go? Caitlin.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'll give that one a go first. Yeah, that's something that, again, is kind of fundamental to the research that we're doing. So thinking about, who has power, who doesn't have power, kind of how is it wielded, how does it show up? And again, when I mentioned kind of the introduction, one of the surprising things is, we often think of like white, cishet, middle-class men as being incredibly privileged, and as if kind of like violence doesn't touch them. But actually what we're finding is that it is touching them in different ways. And so that's something that I think is also good to remember as researchers. And I think actually the research that we did, we were deliberately really trying to cast a very wide net in terms of our demographics. But, so we know the research that shows that like women and Indigenous people, BIPOC folks, queer folks disproportionately experience violence, and that's true. And we have to be doing research with these groups. But I think we also can't forget about other groups as well who we assume have more privilege. So I think that's kind of an important lesson to learn, is that there is still harm that is being carried out with lots of different groups. And I think part of what we have to do is try to really investigate, what does the harm look like? And it looks very, so like extortion, for example, or sextortion looks very different for boys than it does for girls. So for boys, it's a financial scam. It's kind of the latest version of financial scam. And boys are just very, very kind of effective targets. Whereas we think of girls, young women, it's part of grooming process. So it can be in the context of people that they have relationships with, maybe over several weeks, several months. It can be someone that they know in real life or someone that they've met online. With boys, we see this extortion happening in the context of strangers. So people who they haven't met online, haven't met in real person, they only kind of know them online. And then if you're queer, for example, there's particular risks as well. So often this is used as a form of like homophobia or transphobia or outing. So again, really kind of digging deep into the experience and trying to understand, what is going on, what does power look like, I think is really important. And then maybe just the final thing I'll say is that, especially, research that I do with teens who are a group in a society who don't have a lot of power. And especially right now, it's actually a very politically interesting time because we have a very strong parental rights movement that's growing, which is really actually trying to take a lot of power away from young people and kind of put it onto parents. And I think that's something that, as a parent myself, of course, I want to be able to have some control and some kind of say, but also thinking that actually my children have rights and young people also have rights. And so there are kind of these competing balances here that I don't have the answers to. But again, one of the things that comes to mind is, we're often told, for example, Instagram recently changed some of their privacy settings for teens so that they're giving parents more control. And I don't actually think that that's necessarily the best option, because often the control is surveillance. Cornel, you were talking about groups of like queer people who are finding each other, finding community in online spaces. And I don't think we want, and often there's a lot of shame, there's a lot of secrecy around this kind of identity discovery. And if we have parents who are just kind of spying and monitoring, I think that can be really detrimental for many already marginalized groups in society. And particularly if you're queer and you live in a rural area, maybe it's one thing if you're in Toronto or Montreal, where you can find community a little easier, but especially for people who are not in urban areas or in very conservative areas. I'm from Calgary, very, very conservative part of the country. So anyway, so I'll stop there, but hopefully that gave something for other people to kind of touch on as well.
Trina or Cornel? Oh, Cornel, you're up.
I'll sorry, I was trying to figure that out. Yeah, so maybe my response will be a little bit shorter. So tech facilitated violence isn't like a primary theme in the work that I do, but I guess one thing I think about, or one thing I'm thinking about, particularly as it relates to the dating apps, is a question of like scale and scope. So yeah, at the end of the day, like these technologies are just tools. The structure that we're all living in remains the same, right? So I mean, I don't think, people are going to be racist and misogynist and, transphobic, like regardless of whether it's in person or virtual. I think with apps like Grindr or perhaps other platforms, the reach of that kind of violence is broader, bigger, more immediate, perhaps. I was listening to a podcast earlier today that was talking about there was a spate of killings of gay men, I believe it was in Australia some time ago. There have also been some stories about that happening in the Caribbean. We're in a climate where people are now basically catfishing on like gay dating apps, for example, to look for queer folks to, effectively lure them into person and then, attack them, beat them, and then sometimes this happens to be fatal. So I mean, those are some, I guess, preliminary reflections on my end. I think the motivations remain the same, the impulse remains the same, but I think the scale is far bigger in terms of some of the tech related violence.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, the observation about scale, and it is what a dominant trend in terms of dating app related research is violence, deception, and special forms of violence that seem to have arisen alongside certain dating apps. And the whole catfishing piece, sometimes people laugh about it, they groan about it. Ooh, has that happened to you? But it's a sliding scale like anything else. And I was catfished by the same person twice, and it's in the book, but it was scary. It was scary. And people ask why, and there's like all these different websites and support groups for people who have been catfished as well as ghosted. And sometimes we're encouraged to have compassion for the people who infiltrate, our lives like this and, engage in deception. But I think, is it about fear? Is it about, fear of being rejected? Is that why people do these things? And I mean, there are more predatorial reasons as well. But these devices do give us access to one another in really unprecedented ways. And they do open up a lot of opportunities for people to be someone else. And in terms of safety precautions and policies on a lot of online platforms, I mean, that's a constant issue that is being, discussed by a lot of online experts. And there are certain people who are advocating for, banning phones in schools, that kind of thing, which is one approach. But, I think the jury is out in terms of the long-term implications of that. And, if we're interested in behavior change that is going to lead to like healthier spaces and healthier dialogues, communication about gender, about sex, about power, about how we feel when we use these devices. I think we know that fear is never, an effective medium for long-term behavior change. And so fear / banning of phones might not be the most effective way for the long term, but I can understand the rationale that parents have for wanting to do that, wanting to protect their children. I really appreciate what Caitlin was saying about the way that some of children's autonomy, which is already quite limited, is being usurped, with under the banner of protection. It's challenging, but I think sometimes kids really get caught between schools and parents, and then also peers, and then people who we might not always know in terms of where they communicate, because they're communicating in sports and they're communicating in so many different spaces, and they catfish each other. I have nephews who are 10 and 9, and Snapchat is a very powerful, kind of terrifying space. I don't have a Snapchat account, but the information can disappear very, very easily. That's part of the allure of it, and it's a prime space for a whole bunch of really problematic things, as well as spaces of creativity and communication. So I think we have a long way to go before we really kind of can get inside these things in a really formal and sort of immersive way.
Sorry, could I just pick up really quickly on something Trina said? Trina made a point about like access to each other, and I think that's kind of important point to linger with. So back in the days when I was actually on these apps, I used to joke with my friends that you end up sharing information with people that you have never met, that your close friends don't know about you, right? And so you think about, again, my point of reference, at least in the work that I do, has to do with like gay dating apps, right? So you're sending photos, you're exchanging phone numbers, the person might have your address in advance of meeting. There's like voice notes. There might even be conversations about disclosure. So you're giving quite a bit of information like upfront. And so how that data or information can get weaponized is actually, the implications are in some ways larger than if you had a fairly, I don't know, innocent, innocuous kind of like in-person meeting. Like I think some of those things come a bit later on. And maybe we'll get to this a bit later on in the conversation. But I was just thinking too, there was a story a few years ago. I believe Grindr was accused of sharing the HIV statuses of some of the users, and like with third parties, and so that was a kind of big story at the time. So yeah, I think it's this question of like access is actually quite important for us to kind of like think about.
Can I jump in just real quick, Annalise? Sorry. Because also this issue of power, right? It's thinking of the power of the tech companies. And again, you both talked about this, like all the data that we're feeding to it, all the data that we're kind of giving up. And also like tech companies absconding their responsibility to create and design and create spaces that mitigate or minimize harm, or when harm is reported, to do something about it. And again, sometimes why I'm really critical about this idea of we'll just pass it off to parents is because, well, tech companies actually have a really important role to play. They have a lot of power. And right now they seem to be getting away with an awful lot. So part of also what I was thinking was how, we talk about interpersonal violence if someone catfishes someone else, but there's also violence and that's perpetuated through the platforms themselves. And part of what I'm thinking is the algorithms. Algorithms, we know from our research and from other research, that's feeding people content that hurts them. So whether it's, for girls, or women, we often see Fitspiration, Thinspiration, kind of promoting disordered eating. For boys and young men, we're really seeing a lot of what we call like gore bombing. So animal cruelty, beheadings, the Andrew Tate, like the manosphere, we can kind of think also in terms of ideology. And actually, that's something that a lot of governments are really interested in, the radicalization of young men into kind of like anti-feminist rhetoric through these platforms themselves. So thinking about platforms also as very powerful and also as causing harm that for some reason, like we're not really, and I don't mean us, but as the society, we're kind of just letting them get away with it in ways that I think isn't right. And I think we absolutely need to be holding them more accountable for the content and for how they deal with content and respond to problems and issues.
Can I just jump in? Yeah, absolutely. There is kind of a passive acceptance to a certain degree of the way that certain platforms are designed. Well, that's the way, those are the big leading corporations, and that Silicon Valley power. And I think, the way that these apps, in particular dating apps, have been marketed is that they're fun and it's a game. And so that can sort of make the impression that there is no social responsibility. These companies, we have free choice to use them, free choice, they're a game, part of the gamification of romance. But I think, we're starting to sort of, in some ways, kind of come calling, given all the different sort of court cases and things that we're seeing in terms of violence that are directly related to the lack of safety stuff related to these different platforms. So I think things are changing, but in terms of how a lot of these companies are responding, they're just kind of like adding and stirring. They're adding new things to the pre-existing, algorithms and sort of the way things are designed and the way they are marketed, as opposed to, of course, kind of a revolution in design to be more inclusive and safe from the ground up. So yeah, just sort of think that's a very fascinating area.
Well, you've all started to weave into the second question. So Katie, a while ago, you talked about how Instagram implemented parental controls, but how that's in some ways touted as safety driven and curbing violence, but we question that. And Trina, you've started to really weave in this sort of banning of cell phones. And then the overarching structural responsibility these apps and spaces have. So when we think about what are some potential interventions to curbing and mitigating tech-facilitated violence that are not just that surface level, perhaps onus on the parents and what the actual harm that can lead to. And I'm curious whether we have a separation between like individual ways of mitigating tech-facilitated violence and structural ways, because you've put the onus quite a bit on the structural, rightfully so. And I wonder if there's both.
I can go first again. I like how you phrase that, Annalise. I think that it's complicated. There isn't just going to be a single solution. There has to be some kind of individual measures that we take, but also there needs to be some structural changes. So one of the things with the project that I'm on, DIY Digital Safety, we absolutely talk about like rights-based approaches. So we think, educating people about what their rights are is really, really important. So educating them about, or having people understand what their rights are. What is their right to privacy? What is their right to something like bodily autonomy? Sexual integrity. I think that these are really important because one of the things we found in our research is that harms are happening to young people, and many of them don't even recognize what's happening as a form of harm. And that's really worrying. So teaching young people or teaching everybody about what our rights are, and also that we have a collective responsibility to uphold each other's rights is also really important, right? So it's not just making sure that I'm okay, but if I see something that's problematic, that I'm also doing something, if I can be an upstander, I should. So there's kind of that individual level. It's really interesting with our team because we have a legal scholar on board and a criminologist on board. And maybe you might think that they're both kind of like promoting legislative changes. And it's not that they're not. Like, I think it's important to have laws around things like non-consensual sharing of intimate images. Right now, it's actually unclear whether creating a deep fake nude of someone is illegal. It's actually not unless it's an adult doing it of a child. There was recently a Supreme Court case, but like if you have two 16-year-olds who are creating deep fake nudes of one another, right now, it might be brought to court, but right now it's actually not breaking laws, which is quite surprising. So, laws are an important signal of what's acceptable or not acceptable in society. But on the other hand, most people will never use the legal system for justice. They will never reach out to it's too expensive. It's too complicated. Sometimes it escalates things in a way that people don't want things to be escalated. They want to kind of deal with it on a different level. And I'm sorry if you can hear my dog barking in the background. I might have to go pick her up in a minute. So tech options and solutions are the solutions that people are using. So when, if you have something bad happen to you, maybe someone's being creepy or catfishing you online, often like the solutions that we really have are to block, to report. We don't have legal solutions because we may not know where they are. We may not know their jurisdiction. And again, there's a lot of complicated reasons there. So it's really complicated, and it needs kind of multi-pronged approach. And I wish I had all the answers. I don't, but I would love to hear what Trina and Cornel are thinking on this line as well.
Yeah, I don't do like sort of the intervention piece, but I certainly have been observing and have engaged in this behavior myself when I have been sort of accosted someone slipping into my DMs saying they want to be my sugar daddy or they want this or that or it's a bot, and is that you take a screenshot and then you share it on that platform, with whatever information, because it's going to be a fake name, it's probably a fake picture, like it's all fake, but it's watch out for this person. However, then a student of mine about a year and a half ago said, be careful that you don't post those kinds of things too much, because it can, especially on Facebook, because it can signal some sort of thing down the line. You can get more and more of these requests. So it really is kind of a, for me anyways, an obtuse area. But I do think that sort of renegade or, trying to sort of the politics of shame and embarrassment of like flipping those messages and images back on to the same platform where the person is trying to access you, whether for money or for a scam, is kind of interesting. But I think it also kind of reflects the sense of powerlessness that a lot of us feel when this stuff happens to them, in part because we don't have a lot of security stuff on these platforms, in part because a lot of stuff about dating and romance is kind of classified as juvenile. We kind of laugh it off. Oh, dating apps, ooh, they're terrible. Oh yeah, that happened to me. So there's lots of different ways that we can sort of not act on these kinds of behaviors or interventions. And I think also the point about the legal system is that it's often leagues behind where the culture is at. And so that's probably another reason why people are not accessing different kinds of legal resources, because it just isn't quite there yet to help us in a meaningful way.
Yeah, I'll just echo what Trina and Katie said about the legal piece. Technology is moving faster than laws can keep up, right? So I mean, your Katie's point about the deep fakes, I think, it's just a great example. There was a kind of Twitter thing, I believe it was a few months ago. Um, there was I think there were like the story about like deep fakes of Taylor Swift. And I guess maybe to answer the question about curbing or mitigating that, I think users in many cases do a great job of like addressing those problems as collectives, right? So what I guess the Swifties, as they're called, did was replace or like displaced deepfakes with like other kinds of material as a way of kind of like mitigating that kind of violence. I don't use, Reddit super often, but I also think in some spaces there are cultures there around moderation or down voting as a way of kind of like individual steps to kind of I don't know, clear the space as it were of particular kinds of harm. So I do think communities do what they can in some, places to to kind of address some of those problems. There was so I was thinking too about this question of, accessibility around reporting. I don't think there's been a situation where I've tried to report someone. I think I've usually, either blocked. But I do think there's something about, well, do we know that reporting is an option? Like, and how easy is that kind of like process, right? And how sure are we that whatever, I don't know, claim ticket that we put in actually goes somewhere? I think, for many of these platforms, there isn't a very clear or robust system of addressing some of these issues of harm in real time. And so that's a real challenge. But I mean, I guess to one of Katie's earlier points, there is not a lot of incentive or pressure, it feels like, for them to address it. Because I also wonder, I don't do work specifically in this area, but I'm also wondering if there's what am I trying to say? In terms of how these companies are managing data or tracking user engagement, there is some like weird kind of benefit because it means that more users are kind of, even if it's like kind of a negative, like are they, I don't know if I'm making sense here, but like, are they at all, yeah, could you,
They're profiting. Any kind
yeah.
of engagement generates profit. And I think that's kind of a key thing. So in many cases, they're disincentivized to do anything. And again, Taylor Swift is just one example of someone who's had a deep fake nude created, but it was up there for hours and hours before it was taken down. And in fact, it was her account was suspended. That was kind of the solution. And that's also an interesting case, Cornell, because it was the Swifties kind of collectively came together, and anytime they saw a post, they were reporting it and blocking it. But it's also crazy that they were allowed to be posted in the first place because there is technology out there. It's called hashing technology that will clearly identify the image and have it kind of like taken down before it's even posted. So like, why was that tech not used in the situation? Well, back to your point, Cornell, my cynical point is because they profited from it. It generated a lot of interest and discussion and engagement on the platform where they're harvesting data, they're kind of like feeding us advertisements. So I think in kind of with these capitalist social media platforms, I think it's fanciful for us to expect that they're going to behave in any other way. They're really just interested in like enhancing their bottom line. They don't care about us. They don't care about our safety. And one of the measures I often find really interesting is that when you look at like Silicon Valley, that's the highest percentage of media-free schools. So schools that like really try to kind of like reduce the use of tech. There's a lot of research with Google executives and other like Silicon Valley execs who really delay their children's use of media and technology. And I think part of it is because they know it's bad for them. And that to me is like a really strong indicator that these platforms, as much as they say, like Trina, I know we've talked about this, right? Like dating apps, they really want you to find love and happiness. They don't. They don't care. They want as much of your data. They want your eyeballs on the platform. They want you to continually engage with the platform as often as possible. And that's really what motivates them.
All right. Well, you've highlighted the Swifties. as one group who has intervened. And so I'm wondering, whose responsibility is it to intervene when it comes to tech facilitated violence? We're not holding out much hope that the actual platforms themselves will do it. And the Swifties are quite a force, but the rest of us who don't have that, sort of whose responsibility is it to intervene when we see these moments of harm?
I can take a shot at that answer first to give Katie a break. Yeah, so I guess maybe to start, like users have some degree of responsibility to intervene, even if it's just a matter of reporting it. I guess depending on the platform and the kind of community that is cultivated there, people will address it directly with the person. So, on Twitter or Reddit, people will not hesitate to be like, you are wrong for like these particular reasons, right? And so, or you should take this down like quickly and so on. But I guess to one of the points that Katie just made, we do have the technology to intervene more quickly with some of these things, and so yeah, there probably needs to be a bit more pressure put on some of these organizations or businesses to prevent or like preempt some of these things happening in the first place. Again, whether or not they'll be actually pressured or incentivized into doing so, that's maybe a different story. But as we've been discussing, the technology is certainly there. I guess one of the challenges too, though, and maybe Kit and Trina might know a bit more about this. Particularly with certain kind of, I'm thinking specifically platforms like Twitter now. This often devolves into a conversation about, free speech, for example, and it's like, well, I can say what I want, and it's like, well, no, you can't. No, you can't. And that's a kind of like fraught situation right now, right? I mean, and again, Twitter is a kind of like fascinating example because of, particularly because of some of the changes that have, happened over the past few months in terms of which accounts are or are not banned. I do think we also need to keep in mind how these platforms are political spaces, either based on the kind of discourse that takes place there, but even in terms of like how they are very much run, and that certainly shapes what is possible or not possible in terms of like actually addressing some of these challenges too. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think, this is such a ripe area for discussion. And I think it's really one of the things that a lot of us are grappling with. It's like, how do we, or can we pressure these companies into taking more social responsibility? And what does it take? I think of a kind of a famous example of the way that Meta is very much a site of social and sexual inequity is the example of when Tommy Lee, the very famous musician, there was like pretty much a full frontal of him that was left up on Instagram for like 6 or 7 hours. I have a screenshot, PS. And then there are countless people, mainly women and queer artists and activists, who post pictures of different parts of bodies or, just artistic representations of certain kinds of things that may not even be all that sexual, but they're constantly shadow banned. And then they have to reach out to fans and sort of like ask them to report all the time and to do all this additional technical and emotional labor just to be seen in a semi-equitable way on the platform. So I think, so some people are going to smaller platforms. Like a lot of writers are choosing Substack, for instance, because this is a space where there is no advertising and it's beyond the metaverse. So there are platforms that are kind of growing, a little bit niche, but they are growing, and some of them are free. I've got a Substack and it is free, but you can incentivize it, and some people do earn a small income on there. But yeah, I think this is a really fascinating part of the whole sort of space to watch.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. I am on a kick right now where I really think, and it's not going to solve all the problems. I know it's not, but I am really hopeful about this new online harms bill, because right now in its current format, it's kind of proposing like a digital safety commission. So, because right now you can complain, you can report something on any social media platform, and it's really up to them to deal with it. They can decide to grant your request to remove or block someone or suspend their account or not. But then that's it. There's no other kind of like power. So what happens if you're constantly reporting someone and their account is still allowed to remain active? There's nothing you can do. Whereas if this Digital Safety Commission, as it's currently proposed, goes through, there is someone else that you can complain to. They can actually impose large fines, which unfortunately is the only thing that I think companies really care about, because again, it impacts their bottom line. Now, that being said, I know when we look at other countries like Australia that do have an e-safety commission, it's not as though like the violence isn't happening there. It is still happening there. But I do think it sends an important signal that there is a place you can go to try to hold these companies accountable. And we have seen policy changes as a result that I think, have been driven by the fines that have been imposed on these social media companies. So I really think government needs to step up. Of course, individuals have roles to play, communities have roles to play. I'm also a big fan of education. I think we need, Trina, you said that really well, right? Like the bans. Okay, so we just take the tech away and we're not teaching them how to behave as like ethical digital citizens. Like, how is this setting them up for success in the future? So what happens? They turn 18 and they just get a phone and off they go without actually like learning some of the skills that they need, understanding where to go, understanding how to behave. Like I'm not to say that, like, I think that there can be, I think we should really think carefully about the role tech plays in schools. And I think we need to think very carefully about young people's use of digital technologies. But this idea that like the ban outright is going to work. Anyway, sorry, education has a role to play. But again, in a country like Canada, it's so complicated because we have education is regulated differently in all of the provinces and territories. And it's political. So again, we think of what's going on in Alberta right now, very kind of socially conservative, in Saskatchewan and Manitoba. It's not necessarily an easy time. Like sex is hard to talk about anyways, but it seems to be a particularly fraught time to talk about it. So as much as I say, I think we need to have educational interventions, that's not easy to do. Or even you may have great curriculum, but if you get teachers who have no training, who don't know how to have these kind of difficult conversations, so what? So again, it's very, very complicated, but we should still try.
I appreciate the hopeful note at the end. Thank you, Caitlin. So folks, we have a couple more questions, but I did want you to think through, if you have any questions for our panelists, you can DM them to me in the chat function. So you can't send it as a full group chat, and please make sure you send it to me so that I make sure I can ask them. But think that through over the next couple questions as we work through the last bit here. So a couple of you have actually started to share some of your own lived experience in using this tech and the experiences of harm that you've then had and ensued. So writing about tech, sexuality, power can be difficult, both the sort of abstract writing of it, but the lived experience of engaging with it as well, especially as feminists and queer scholars. How do you navigate these difficulties personally and professionally?
I'll go again, but I do, I should have maybe tried to jump in a little bit earlier because I didn't maybe, I'll just like add a quick question to see if, as I'm answering, to see if Trina and Katie has any thoughts. So I guess the first question has to do with the banning phones. And I guess my sense is that young people are far better with technology than their parents. And so I guess part of the question is like, will banning actually work? Because I suspect young people will find ways to circumvent that, I guess is one thing. And then while on one hand, we are advocating reporting, like improving the kind of like reporting mechanisms for instances of tech-based violence, I'm also wondering how reporting can potentially be used, like weaponized to, I don't know, censor, let's say, I don't know, for example, the educational material, or if people are posting any types of, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know. So you might have folks thoughts about that. To answer the specific question though about what was the question? Insight. Sorry, could you repeat the question for me?
Well, I wonder if we pause my question and we let Caitlin and Trina take on your questions because they were great.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
I can respond a little bit to the one about banning.
Yeah.
And I mean, the banning, so they don't have formal access while they're at school. Now so that's like 8 hours a day. But as you say, I think there are stories about ways that students are circumventing that and having access. Some instances where there's like one sort of phone for the whole classroom in the event that there is like an emergency or something. So, some of those things have been tried, but again, I think a lot of these are very new. So I think people are really in the experimental phase. But yeah, I think that the banning really closes off the conversations. But I guess it depends on the context because they might have a school where they're banning phones, but if they're having formative, generative, open, inclusive discussions about why and different scenarios and maybe bringing in interesting speakers and things that are cool for kids depending on where they're at in terms of age, ability, etc. Well, then maybe that's okay. So I think it's sort of like as with everything, the context is so important. But I think, just the abstract removal of the phone without any kind of supplementary dialogue is not really going to accomplish all that much. And it will just sort of make it seem perhaps even more enticing or, can drive the kinds of behaviors that students or people are engaging in sort of below the surface and make them be quiet and secretive about some of those things and less likely to share with the adults in their life or their peers. So, yeah.
And it becomes one more thing that teachers or in schools are having to police. So, they're spending a lot of, so fine, kids aren't allowed to bring a phone to school, but they do, and they're so small. They hide it in their pocket and then they go to the bathroom and they're kind of using it there. But the other thing I do often want to point out too is that I think we need to also recognize technology isn't just one thing, even like a phone. So like, there's so many good uses of phones, and I have like friends who are teachers, high school teachers, who tell me about like phones are great because students will take pictures of things for lab reports, or you use it as a timer in like a science experiment, or you're using it to look up information, right? So like in those kinds of contexts, I think it's really important. I think what we don't need in schools is like kids being on TikTok or watching Netflix. Like that's not helpful for their education. So also kind of parsing out the differences between, it's not saying that we shouldn't have tech in schools. It's like, how is the tech being used? Like, what is the kind of purpose of the tool there? But yeah, teachers, yeah, and it just becomes one more thing that teachers are having to like police, and they're already overburdened and overstretched. And there's often a lot of conflict because in many cases, it's actually the parents who want their kids to have the phone. Kids have anxiety, kids have different learning disabilities where actually they have to use tech as part of like different recovery plans in school. So again, there is a lot, it's quite complicated there. But I like what you said, Trina, about like just banning it and like not having the conversation isn't helping at all. Okay.
Well,
Thank you.
So the question was, writing about sexuality, tech, and power can be difficult, both the lived experience of perhaps engaging in those spaces, but also sort of the abstract, vicarious trauma of reading about a lot of the harm, especially as feminists and queer scholars. So how do you navigate these difficulties personally and professionally?
I guess I have one quick anecdote I can share. So I mentioned in the introduction that I was a part of this study that was focusing on, gay and bi men's experiences during COVID, and there were a few interviews where people were talking about how like lonely and isolated they were, and there was one particular interview with a trans participant who was talking about they're stuck at home with their partner who doesn't really get their experience, and it's like hard for like all the reasons, and the online having an online community is one thing, but it's like it's not the same. And so by the end of the interview, we're like both in tears. And I wasn't I wasn't prepared for something like that to happen. And halfway through doing the interviews, it became apparent that I might be the only person that someone talks to for that day, right? That is, and so those are, yeah, experiences that is like sometimes hard to sit with. I mean, part of what I've tried to do is to like honor those experiences in the writing. I haven't quite figured out uh, an answer to like what does one do with yourself after you've been a part of you've kind of like sat with that. But yeah, so all that to say, those things are hard, and I think with that particular situation, I I mean, part of my work now is really thinking about questions of connection and like how to uh, cultivate that in different kinds of spaces or the different ways that queer people establish community. So yeah, that's an ongoing thing for me at the moment, but I don't have a kind of like fulsome response to that.
I think it's something that really evolves, I mean, working exclusively with different vulnerable communities for 20 plus years, I mean, the things that I carry with me are quite profound. And it's different when it's online in the sense that, just a touch on someone's shoulder after a tough interview, or just, even just holding hands with someone for like a second before you leave where you're doing the interview, if that's appropriate. I mean, those are moments that of deep connection in a way, because sometimes you're often interviewing people who you might never see again and they're strangers to you, except within the context of that research. And I think similar to what Cornel said about finding ways to write about it and honor it and acknowledge it and, and sort of it's part of your emotional kind of psychological landscape. But I think also talking to our students about it is really important, not just our grad students, but also our undergrads who are very interested in like, how does research work? What does it look like? And also, what does it feel like? And I think that by putting our emotions, both complicated, well, when our emotions not complicated, but the tensions are really productive. And they do open us up and can open up new spaces of consideration of research and emotions and space, etc. What it is we're doing, but the how we are feeling when we're doing it, I think is really important. And there's more and more people writing about it. But I think that over time, we just sort of pick up different strategies as we go, depending on where we're at in our particular emotional sort of situation and where we're at with the project. But I think, yeah, it's really important to think about.
Yeah, thanks, Trina and Cornel. I appreciate both of your answers. And kind of what I took away from it is like, it's hard. It can be really hard. Some days it's fine, but some days it just really hits you. And so kind of same thing with you, Trina. I've been, before I did this project on tech facilitated sexual violence, I did many years researching like the Me Too movement or the ways that people are using social media to disclose experiences of sexual violence, and reading through thousands of disclosures or watching YouTube videos where people are disclosing, and they are curating these videos to generate an affect. So they're filming them in black and white. There's really melancholic music in the background. They're designed to like punch you in the stomach. And it's hard. And I've written about I have a book called Digital Feminist Activism where we wrote about, I used to be able to just blast through analysis. And like for that project, I just couldn't. I had to take breaks, self-care and collective care. I had to be kind of like aware of what was going on. I've seen therapists. I talk about feelings with like team members, and now, I'm a mentor. We have lots of different research assistants on projects. So really trying to kind of um, open up my own vulnerabilities and being like, man, like that was really hard. And that, I had to kind of like take a break. Like I couldn't do anything for the rest of the day. I think talking about it, and I've got a few of my students on this call some of whom are researching really difficult subjects. And part of also what I feel is also my responsibility with students, especially ones who are doing PhDs on like intimate partner violence, gender-based violence, is, I'm glad you're tackling this topic, but it is really hard. And you're going to have days where you're like, why am I doing this? Like, this is incredibly, incredibly difficult. So just know that it's hard. Just know that you're not the only one. The collective is so important. So, I have great teams. I have people who I can talk to about my feelings, and then also self-care. So like meditation, yoga, all of these things have been incredibly, incredibly helpful. And also, if you look at my publications, so I'll write something about me too, and then I'll do something. In fact, I'm doing it with some of the research assistants on this call, trad wives. So I kind of have like projects that aren't about really deep, dark things. And I need that for my own sanity because I can't just study sexual violence all the time. It's too depressing. And then maybe just the final thing I'll say is I always look for the hope. So, what are the hopeful stories that we can find? Because when people are disclosing things to you, it's so easy to think like all of humanity is shit. People suck. But I don't want to live in a world where I think that people suck. So people also tell me great stories about community and someone who's helped them and someone who believed them, or, so I kind of try to hold on to those kind of nuggets of hope as well. And those do help me get through those darker moments where I just think, wow, like this is really hard. It's hard to bear sometimes. So yeah, it's hard.
Thank you each for that. We've had a couple questions come in, so I do want to turn to those and make sure we have time to address each of them. So I'm going to read the question and then put it to one of you, but of course you all can then answer, but I'll start with somebody. So far, we've discussed how vaccine declarations create new or contribute to old hierarchies of desirability. Are there other mechanisms on dating apps that contribute to the reinforcement of these hierarchies? And Cornel, I'm going to turn that to you first.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, there is a body of research that talks about the dating apps and like racial hierarchies and sexual desirability. There are scholars who talk about it within the context of body type. There's also a conversation about what that looks like in terms of HIV status as well. So, I mean, there are all of these different ways that people make decisions about who is or is not desirable, who is or is not quote unquote safe to have sex with or to be a potential partner. Interestingly enough, a few years ago, Grindr removed a couple of the filters. I know that they had removed the race or ethnicity filter, and in response to some concerns around that. But funny enough, there are people of color I guess maybe to backtrack, they had removed it because there was some concern that it facilitated a certain kind of preferential treatment for like white users, basically. So people of color were largely screened out. But then when it was removed, there were, some users that were talking about, well, having some of those filters actually made it easier to find other people of color, and now it's kind of like hard. So I mean, there are some challenges around that as well. So I mean, I don't know, people will have different feelings around that. But yes, I mean, vaccination was at the time one of the more the particularly, important kind of like aspect for folks to kind of think about whether or not someone was a safe sexual partner. So, and I mean, I had said that too, being partially vaccinated wasn't enough. Some of the guys I spoke to would even say that they needed like printed copies. Like you can't just have a declaration on your profile. They had to have some kind of proof, which I actually thought was quite interesting. I mean, one of the things that came up was there was a culture of distrust and suspicion. I mean, and people would make comments about I should also mention that part of what's embedded in the hierarchy too is a certain kind of judgment around who they saw as the Puerto Vallarta gays, right? So the quote unquote irresponsible gays who were like traveling and flouting social distancing guidelines, and the quote unquote responsible ones who were at home, who were making, I don't know, quote unquote smart, responsible decisions. So, but yeah. So I guess I'll leave it there for now. But if other folks have thoughts about that, that's fine.
I think a couple other ways that people have sort of marked and ranked desirability on dating apps, beyond the vaccination piece and some of the other things that Cornel was saying, was also about relationship containers. As I was using dating apps, over the course of 5 or 6 years, off and on, I began to see many more, like on the mainstream dating apps, like not on a space like Field, which caters to poly and sort of different kinds of relationship structures. But it was kind of evident that there's a real increase in the sort of the cultural valence of being poly or being non-monogamous. And some people would have those like front and center in their profiles and or the description, and this is what I want, this is what I don't want. And so that was interesting. That seemed to be really on the rise, which I found interesting. And also people claiming different kinds, or expressing, maybe celebrating different kinds of status with respect to being neurodivergent, or different kinds of aspects of their identity, which I would never have seen around 2017, 2018, when I just started swiping. So those two things are things that I certainly noticed that were on the increase and featured more and more prominently in people's profiles, ostensibly as a way to not just identify, but then also to use in terms of classifying and sort of sorting and selecting one another as well.
Very surprisingly, I have something to add to this question, given that my research isn't on dating apps, but teenagers actually often use Snapchat for dating. So actually, we're working on this paper called Tinder for Teens that's looking at how young people are circumventing even some of the safety features that Snapchat has to like find romantic relations. And one of the really interesting things that comes out is Snap Score. So I don't know who's on this call. I don't know how familiar people are with Snapchat, but you kind of have like metrics. It's the gamification, I suppose, of Snapchat, where you get metrics depending on how active you are on the platform. And what was really interesting is that boys were using this to slut shame girls. So to kind of choose whether or not they wanted to instigate a relationship with someone. So either saying, no, her Snap score is too high, she must talk with all the guys. Or maybe she's easy because look at how high her Snap score is. Whereas girls were using it to kind of decide, well, is this someone who's going to respond to me? So girls were actually looking for a guy with a higher Snap score because it perhaps indicated that he was someone who would be a responsive partner to them. And that was something we were not expecting to find, but came up a lot amongst teens. I should say, because one of my RAs is on this project. This was a project I did in the UK. So it was with British teens, specifically talked about this.
That one's going to leave me thinking for a little bit. So we have another question, and Caitlin, you did touch upon this briefly earlier, but I wonder if you can expand a bit on it. So the person says, I don't know much about the law in Canada. I want to know if there are any legal consequences for users who create or share or sell deepfake content in Canada or the UK, or other places in the world. They ask because they knew a Taiwanese YouTuber who was sentenced to years in jail because he was caught creating and selling deepfake content anonymously, and just wondered about any case precedent here.
So there was just recently a case that went to the Supreme. So right now, in terms of criminal code, deepfake nude is not in it. So in theory, creating deepfake content isn't a criminal offense. There are a few provinces like British Columbia that have introduced civil legislation. So someone won't go to jail, but you can sue them if they create sexualized deepfake content. So BC is one of the provinces. I think Saskatchewan's another province. I can't remember all of them. And that's often linked with their civil laws that they have around non-consensual distribution of intimate images. So some of those provinces have kind of said, okay, even if it's synthetically generated, which is kind of the term that they use to talk about deepfakes. I mentioned that there was a Supreme case court that recently, it was a man was creating deepfake images of children and he was sentenced. But that's kind of the only case in Canada that I know of. So it still is like a bit of a murky terrain. I will just share this though. Not Okay, yeah, no, the question was about deepfakes, so maybe I won't go off into like a joke or not, but I'll put it in the chat if I can. Our website, we have some infographics that talk about nude image sharing and the laws in Canada. So I'll just pop some links in there and that will explain. That's not about deepfakes, but it's about nude image sharing specifically with teenagers.
Wonderful. So someone sent in a question that I actually think is a beautiful one to end with. So I do hope each of you are prepared to answer it if you are so willing. How can we best have productive discussions about sex, tech, and power with our friends and family? Trina, I'm putting you on the spot first.
Well, I think it's it's a lovely question. Well, I think one of the best ways is to start early. And for parents or people in education systems or other people involved in, let's say, young people's lives, before jumping into discussions with the young people in our lives, I think it's worth having conversations about where we're at with these issues, because a lot of people have not been raised with good sex ed. And just because you study it doesn't mean you're at a space where you're comfortable with who you are. And that just has such a huge impact on how you impart knowledge and the feeling that people get when they speak with someone, so I think those are just thinking about, the importance of it, and that, it is a process, certainly, and also advocating for it. And having, conversations that are fairly open, not necessarily graphic, but that are kind of complicated in front of young people, and just also, they model our behavior. They model the way we speak about things. So I think, checking in with ourselves, and there's an embarrassment of resources, at our disposal, globally, locally, in terms of how to have these kinds of conversations and what we might need to begin them. And so I think, yeah, that's kind of what I'll say in response to that question.
I will take control. Cornel, would you go next?
Sure. I mean, I don't have a whole lot to add. I mean, yeah, I would agree that part of this probably needs to be addressed so we acknowledge that there are particular limitations or problems with sex ed curriculum as is. I do think more and more we'll have to think about how do we integrate conversations about technology as part of that curriculum. I mean, one thing that I was thinking about is we should, and this isn't specific to sex ed, but I think when we're having conversations about consent, it might be useful for, I don't know, families to have conversations to ask each other, well, what are we actually consenting to when we sign up for these applications, right? Like no one's, spending time reading terms and conditions and all of that. So I mean, even in terms of like how our data is being used, I also think it could, I mean, part of that is also kind of like safety and security question around like what is appropriate or safe in terms of if you're, I don't know, sharing photos or names, like they're kind of, I don't know, baseline data or information. I think that families should generally have a conversation about like what's appropriate or not appropriate. Yeah, and I mean, yeah, I guess that's about all that comes to my mind off the top of my head. I think. Oh, actually, maybe one more thought. I think we are already using various kinds of apps, and so maybe some of these more banal seeming apps could be a point of entry into some of those conversations. So maybe you're in these like family group chats. And so if you're like, WhatsApp, whatever, there's a way that we can think about platforms like that as being like a series of many that we end up engaging with over the course of our lifetime. And maybe how do we navigate conversation on WhatsApp, and like how do we carry out some of those same, I don't know, principles around courtesy and respect and like decency over to these other rights. Because I mean, presumably people might already be having conversations about, oh, you know, that wasn't inappropriate or a nice thing to have shared, or you weren't giving permission. I think some of those principles I think could have been easily addressed in some of those, you know, kind of spaces, and then that might help to inform how people are using some of these other platforms that are more focused on like questions of like sex and sexuality potentially.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Thanks both Trina and Cornel for doing the heavy lifting there. I would say these conversations are rarely easy, but I think that they are so important to have. And like parents, it can be so discomforting to talk about with your children. People in intimate relationships, these conversations can also be really deeply uncomfortable, but I think we have to have them. I'm going to kind of focus my answer more in the context of youth. One thing we know is that young people they don't want to be judged or shamed. And that's unfortunately like most adults' response is to judge and shame when they have these kinds of conversations. They use the fear-based approach, fear-mongering. Well, if you do this, you're going to go to jail. If you do this, your life is over. Only an idiot would do that. And those messages hurt young people. I actually just had a call earlier today with some folks in New Zealand who were going around talking to young people about harmful content. And when they asked young people what they wanted when they kind of disclosed, or if they were to disclose the kind of content they were engaging in, and I wrote this line down, they want to be hugged, they want to not be judged, and they want to be respected. So sometimes it maybe just takes a moment for those of us who are having these difficult conversations to take a breath, suppress that initial urge to yell, to freak out, to kind of like blame, because that doesn't help. That's not helping young people. That's not helping us have these kinds of conversations. It's shutting the conversations down. And that's, I think, one of like the most worrying things. So it's okay if it's discomforting. One of the things I often say to parents is like, and it could apply to anyone with these uncomfortable conversations. It doesn't have to be the big conversation, like sat down face to face. Do it while you're out for a walk. Do it while you're in the car. Do it while you're not having to make eye contact, which feels really intense. Don't just have one conversation. It needs to be multiple times. And Cornel, I think you were kind of showing this, right? It can be on everyday moments. So, like, hey, like what apps are you using these days? Let's scroll through them. I don't know, like what do you see or what do you think about? Like, so kind of like going through different scenarios, I think can be really important. Or just like, what are you seeing that's weird or upsetting you or kind of bugging you? So it doesn't have to be like, oh my God, there were some deep fake nudes that were circulating. Have you ever done it? Have you ever seen them? Like, you don't have to start with the most serious. You can kind of start with like the banal, the everyday, and hopefully you get comfortable having these uncomfortable conversations.
Well, what a great question to end on. Trina, Caitlin, Cornel, thank you each for being here and sharing all of your analysis and also some lived experience into this. I appreciate that. James is on the call. Thank you for organizing as well. And to each of you who did show up tonight, we appreciate that, your active listening and your questions as well. So have a good evening, everyone. Thank you.